All right, here we go. Welcome to my Mech Rendering demo. I'm starting out here with a little brush pen thumbnail sketch that I did, and it was very tiny actually, and maybe an inch and a half tall. Scanned it and dropped it into Photoshop, and the first thing I like to do is pick it off of the background, which I just did with a magic wand. And the reason I use the magic wand is because I wanted to include the white on the interior, so I can do that little levels adjustment there and darken it down. And these are some photographs I have. Taken of this is actually all off the USS Midway in San Diego. And one of the things I like to do when working this way is to quickly see some colors and values to establish my color palette. So that's where I'm throwing these photographs onto my original image file and close them all. And now I like to make a clipping path. So as you can see my little text there, hold the Option Alt key to create a clipping mask. And it's a clipping mask layer, and what it does, you see the little arrows there on the right in my layer stack, is it looks at the original silhouette of my base layer, and then it makes them the same shape. So it reads the silhouette below, and it fills it with the photograph above. And here I'm just dropping a little background. I took one of the images, pulled a little color palette off of it, enlarged it, and there's my clipping path layers working. And that's going to be the color palette of my environment. And now I'm just going to move the images around. And these are on top of my little sketch that we isolated from the background. And we have a clipping path layer set. So it reads the silhouette of the sketch below. And I'm moving my source image above, just distorting it, moving it around. And really I'm just looking for color, texture. Maybe I get some interesting little details here and there. You can also see I'm changing my compositing method to my layer. I put that on overlay. I'm also adjusting the levels of my base sketch a little bit darker. That's to help get a little bit more color into it so it's not so white, not so light in value. And here I just flipped horizontal on that reference photo I'm using, and again put it to overlay, and I'm distorting it, moving it around. I'm looking for design details or little happy accidents in the alignment of that photograph that I took. I'm also just looking for color, texture. So this is a really fun way to start any sketch because you don't have to come up with that color palette from scratch, and you might get lucky. It's always great to be better lucky than good. So here we go, moving around a few more things. So I brought in quite a few. I brought in 5 of these photographs. A lot of times I'll just use 1, maybe 2, but to show the range of diversity for this little demo. And again, a little levels adjustment. This is the photograph itself. And there you can see. So now what I've done is I'm painting on the background just to give it a bit more of a ground plane. Give our little mech a spot to stand. And like I said, this is a really fun way to work because you don't have to come up with something from scratch. It's great if you go out and shoot all your own photography. You own all the photos that are within your image, so you don't have to worry about anything coming off the internet or low quality artifacts, etc. And it's all original stuff that you've gone out and shot, and it will make your painting, your rendering, also more original. I'm doing a little cleanup now to my base brush pen sketch. My base sketch was really loose. As you can see, the perspective is very loose, and edges, etc. So I'm just taking an eraser, and you can see I'm working on my base layer now, and I'm just going back and I'm erasing different areas. Now I'm turning on and off my photographs that I've put on top. And now I'm going to experiment a little bit more before I make my final decision on which one or ones work the best. And what I'm doing is painting back into that photograph layer. There were some dark areas, so my original sketch wasn't showing up, right? Because we're just overlaying on top of the original base sketch, which is just a normal layer. So I'm painting back in, and I'm just lightening up areas of that photograph to see if this is the one that I want to use. So I'm just color picking from within the photograph and painting right back on top. And I'm trying to combine them a little bit. I kind of like those yellow feet that are showing up. I'm lightening up areas of this photograph as well. And the way I'm lightening it is I'm just it's just a normal paintbrush, and I'm just painting right back into that layer, and I'm just color picking from within the painting. So I kind of thinking about those colored feet. I kind of like that. That was again, these are all sort of happy accidents along the way. And turning them on and off and see how they mix with each other. So you don't have to limit yourself to just one of these things overlaying. You can mix them all together. They're all set to overlay, so they'll mix with each other. And I like to do that, just turn them on and off and evaluate which ones look the best or not. And then I'll delete the ones that we don't use. So again, this is a really fun sort of happy accident abstraction way of working, where you can't predict the way these things are going to mix together. There I'm changing the order of them. But I find that it's really gives you a lot of especially if something sort of, just sort of random sci-fi thing, you get a lot of photographic texture put in there, and it brings a lot of realism to your sketch immediately. And I'm working back again on my base layer. So that's basically just refining the original sketch, making design changes, adding a bit of structure there to the legs to give them a bit more realism, hinting that there's some sort of mechanism below, attaching that far gun. I sort of lost it when we pulled it off the background. And working on adding back the symmetrical gun on the other side. And now I'll show you a little example of what the painting really looks like at 100% speed. This is kind of my refinement phase now. You see I just added a layer to the very top. And what I do is I just pick from within the painting, and I start glazing around. And you can see I can still see all the line drawings and the shapes of my original sketch. And I pick a little bit of the background color. So there's maybe a little chamfered edge there that rolls away from our line of sight, and it starts to pick up the color and the value of the background. Same across the top. My lighting situation for this little rendering is lighting coming from the right hand side and fairly low. So the side of the bot, or the vehicle here, whatever it is, maybe we haven't really decided on scale yet, but most of the light, so this side of the shape is going to be brighter than the top, and the top is still going to receive a little bit of light, but it's going to pick up more of it's really our number 2 side. All right, here we're going to speed it back up. It's not so boring. It's like watching paint dry, that speed. It can get, where you can really get bogged down in the speed part, of course, when you're painting, is making design decisions. Not so much the rendering stuff generally goes pretty fast, especially for something like this. So here I'm just starting to refine details. And I think this is probably 2.5 to 3 times speed, and I'll keep it sort of at this speed for the painting part for the rest of the tutorial. So I'm picking up some ground color there and dropping it on the underside. That will be our shadow side, so our number 3 side. So the vertical sides are going to be our 1 that receive the most amount of light, and the top surface will be what I always refer to as number 2. It has a little bit of light, but not as much as the number 1 side. And number 3 side is the shadow side. And that terminology refers back to the matte surface shading DVDs or tutorials I did for the Gnomon Workshop. Here are just adding details. So a lot of times I'll do that. I'll just pick the same color and value that's on the side, drop in some little louvers or something in a shadow, and then just glaze over it a little bit. With a little shadow value, and you just knock them back into that hole so they're not getting any light. So nowadays I tend to work this way a lot, where I don't actually do a lot of finished line drawings that much. I tend to do looser sketches and scan them in, and then layer over some colors and textures like I'm doing, and we just did earlier with the photographs. And then I just start painting and glazing back over. And I like the textures that I get, 1 from the photographs, but 2 from my original sketch. And I do the design refinements in this painting pass. And so right now I'm just sort of making folds and bending sheet metal and thinking about, well, what's going to happen with this surface? Where does it come along here and it's flat, and then it rolls and maybe turns back towards the light? And if it does, it picks up a little bit more brightness right? So you adjust your value. And here this rolls under, that's the shadow. I'm picking up a little bit of ground color there, so a little bit of reflected light, bringing that into the underside, and that will help tie this shape into its environment by picking up a little bit of that color, increasing the value shift there by going a little bit darker, and starting to now refine this near side. Looks like some sort of machine gun thing, and picking again colors and values from within my painting. You see I'm just really on one layer up at the top, and it's over the top of all the other ones, and starting to get a little bit of form put into those barrels by adding a little core shadow and some reflected light, and a couple little scratchy little details here and there. This one's going to stay pretty loose. You know, they're not going to be, I'm going to use some paths, but I'm going to use some paths later to correct the perspective, but I'm not going to use paths anywhere for my shapes. Everything's just going to stay freehand. I should say I'm probably working on a 21-inch Cintiq, so the freehand painting is a little bit easier on that kind of setup than it is with a straight Wacom tablet. And here just looking at my original drawing from my sketch and deciding, are those the shapes I want to keep? What are those shapes really doing? Again, this sort of happy accidents and using photographs abstractly by layering them really works best if you have a good set of foundation skills to work with, meaning you know how to show form with value, you understand perspective. If you don't have those things, you know how to cast shadows. You know, and in this case, I'm casting shadows very loosely, just in a sort of general, you know, direction with the lighting from the right. But if you have that stuff and you've mastered those foundation skills, it allows you to go in and have a lot of fun and use this abstraction and use a really loose sketch and start to refine it directly in Photoshop. So again, I'm kind of just, this is the sort of making things go bump. So I'm just bending that panel and pushing it into maybe like a little louver. There's maybe a gap between that panel and the other one, the other vertical. Refining these little horizontal ribs. And again, I kind of like the feel that you get with the sketch showing through. The light's catching that edge, so that's a little louver. Although I don't know how it's connecting to that vent there at the bottom, but maybe we just can't see that. There's a whole bunch of little Escher moments in this with little folding elements that are probably not doable in reality. So now I'm going to go back and refine my base layer a bit more. And you see I had some other colors on it from color picking from my photographs. What I did there is I just went in and hit Command U and changed the saturation back to 0, so it's all grayscale. And I'm really getting my colorizing coming out of my photographs. So now I'm going to go back and find the center line. Again, it was a very small little 1.5-inch tall thumbnail sketch, and I'm trying to resolve now the design through this sort of centerpiece and the undercarriage of this robot thing, this mech. And maybe I'll do some pointy little elements on top of the feet or the legs. Alright, now I've got a eraser, just erasing a couple elements. I'll go back and keep on painting. And so I'm basically going back and this is refining, trying to work out a little bit of symmetry, adding a bit of pseudo mechanism down there to make it look a little bit more believable, like it can articulate. But it's by no means well thought out. It's just really indication, and maybe opening up a couple of holes, erase those out so we see through to the background. And at this point, pretty soon I'm going to have to figure out what's going on with this perspective, but for now I'm still thinking just about the design, trying to get some rough symmetry blocked in. Again, just eyeballing everything and trying to work out the silhouette. Again, because of the way I have my layers set up, and I'm using those photographs stacked for colorizing and my refinement layer on the very top, I can go back to my original base and just keep it grayscale like this and focus in only on design and symmetry. So really it's just drawing and design on this base layer. And I think that helps quite a bit to not try to worry about the sort of illustration at the same time and color at the same time as you're trying to work out the design. So in a way it makes it, I think, a little bit simpler for me to figure out and think only about, you know, is this silhouette the best it can be? Is the stance right? Are the proportions right? Are these graphics working? Meaning the graphics in the context of, you know, like that dark vent on the side at the top there, is that the right shape, right? It's dark against light, so I call that a graphic. Even though it's a hole, still sort of visually we see it as a graphic. So doing a bunch of refining to the form. And this is really the sort of sketch cleanup, silhouette cleanup, and design time. So now I use paths to create a perspective grid. And I want to get some guidelines here. So what I've done is I've zoomed back and I pull in some guides for a horizon line and a vertical to the left, and I make a new path layer, grab the pen tool, and I'm going to click and then click again. And don't click and drag, otherwise you'll get handles showing up for a curve. You want just straight lines. The other thing I'm doing is I'm hitting A, and that will go to the white arrow. It allows me to unselect that pen tool and start a new line. So it's all on one path layer, as you can see. And I've just pulled some guidelines loosely from a left vanishing point. Then what I'm going to do is go to the white arrow, and I'm going to snap those to my guides. So I'm grabbing the end of each one, the point at the end of each line, and I'm snapping it to that intersection. Okay, now I've created basically a little perspective grid, and I'm going to line up a few of those lines with some of the bigger elements in my rendering, like the tops of the legs. It's sort of, then, you know, the gun barrels, make sure those are straight across from each other, maybe the underside of that. There's a couple straight lines there, there's a couple straight lines through the front grille. And now I just grab that line and I hit Command C, Command V. So I'm actually copying and pasting that line and then pulling those points to spread out a few more lines. Okay, and now I'm going to adjust my perspective. It looks like I had a fairly long lens when I did this sketch, meaning slow convergence. So I've just moved my left vanishing point further to the left. Now the beauty of doing it this way with paths is that you don't have to worry about the thickness of the line or that sort of stuff if you try to use the line tool. Also, we can actually go to a real vanishing point off of our page. So I zoom back even further, and I'm going to copy that path layer. I'm going to flip it horizontal to find my right vanishing point. And it's kind of a 45 view, meaning a 45 view we see sort of equally we see the front and the side. Now I've gone to a little brush and I'm putting a layer on the very top, and basically that little second button from the left in the path menu strokes that entire canvas with that little, I think, 3-pixel brush. So I used a white 3-pixel brush, and those are my guidelines now, and they're floating on the top of my render stack, or sorry, my layer stack. And I'm going to be able to use those to help me fix the perspective. The thing I noticed though when I zoomed in is it was white on white, and made it a little bit difficult because of the long lens to tell what was the left vanishing point and what was the right vanishing point. So I'm going to restroke those with green so that my right vanishing point is defined by the green lines and my left defined by the white. And now I'm going to change the opacity of that layer so it'll be there on top of my drawing or my rendering, and I can reference it. So you can see now I'm going to go back to my base layer and back to grayscale, and I'm going to start to refine the silhouette based on those guidelines. Again, I'm still eyeballing. This is definitely not, you know, I'm not measuring out anything, and I'm not, you know, auto foreshortening with constructions or etc. But it's going to be better than it would have been without dropping this grid on it. The nice thing about this grid, this sort of having these path layers, any other Photoshop file that I want to open, I can just pull those path layers over into that other Photoshop file, which means I don't have to rebuild those perspective grids. And you can make as many of these things as you want. You make a 1-point perspective grid, you can make a 3-point, you can have multiple points, and you can always just drop them over into any new rendering just by dragging that path layer into the other file, and just move those points around until they line up with your sketch. So in a way, doing perspective in Photoshop is actually much easier than doing it on a regular piece of paper with a pen and pencil and a straight edge. So I always tell my students it's really no excuse for getting the perspective, keeping the perspective weak inside Photoshop, because it's so much easier to do. And back to doing design refinements. Again, these are unrefined areas that I hadn't addressed in my sort of cleanup layer at the top where we were painting color before. So here we go. I'm dropping in some more lines and refinements, and I'm really now looking at my perspective grid a little bit, trying to line up those edges, fix the symmetry, cleaning up the silhouette. So it's usually just erasing or painting. One of the things to remember here is that in order to use the clipping path layer properly, floating across the top, is you can't start picking the background color to fix up your silhouette. So you have to slow down a little bit and grab an eraser when you want to clean up your silhouette. It's very easy to forget that, because we really just, in the context, if you were traditionally trained in rendering and painting, a lot of times you would just grab whatever's your background color and value and use that to clean up your edges and clean up your silhouette. In this case, I'm really defining a mask, right, with a clean silhouette edge that's erased. So I'm clicking between the eraser and the paintbrush so that my clipping path still works. Because without a clean edge, that clipping path isn't going to be the right shape. So those little ribs come around the back and then they dive down, maybe on a little V angle. They're not following my perspective grid because they don't stay horizontal across the back. I'm actually having them bend downward a little bit. And I thought it'd be nice if I showed a little bit of that leg, the back leg there, and holding that edge a bit. So I just notched it out a little. Again, my symmetry is very loose left to right, but at least getting the general directions correct for left and right vanishing points, for any horizontal lines going across the front of this shape, and then if there are any parallel lines to the ground going down the side, which there's a couple. It's mostly about getting the ground plane right and getting the legs, sort of the top of the legs right, and the guns, and those horizontal lines across the front center line. And now I'm just roughing in a couple of pivots here, looking at the far side, coming back to the near side, and trying to eyeball the symmetry, add a little bit of tech in there. Again, all very loose, but sort of getting the idea across. I think total running time on this rendering, start to finish, before I sped it up, was about 2.5 hours. So keep that in context. It's now sped up to about 52 minutes, roughly. All right, so more refinements. Now, I could have done this by doing an overlay. I could have taken that little thumbnail sketch and blown it up, on a copy machine and done an overlay and resolved all this and with markers and traditional media, made a nice line drawing and then brought it in. And there's no right or wrong. It's whatever you feel comfortable with. You could have even redone the drawing here. I could have done all this first before we put the photos on top. But a lot of times I like to see that color and texture and just see if there's anything there before spending any time refining the design. Because sometimes when you pull it off the background and you see the silhouette with color and value, you might not like it as much. And so it's so fast to do. It's actually much faster than doing this part of it. So I kind of like to check that first and see if it's going to work. And now I'm just resolving the shapes across the front, this sort of front center area, and thinking my lighting's coming from the right. There's probably going to be a little cast shadow. Maybe that corner of a little blade sticks out there. I'm going to turn down the opacity of my guidelines even more. Turn back on my color, which are my top two photographs mixed together, and my cleanup layer. All right, there's my top two photos. And now I'm going to go back and I'm actually refining my photo because it was too dark in here to show the shapes I just dropped in. The shapes I refined in my grayscale aren't showing up because the photograph was too dark. So you just color pick from within the painting, lighten it up a little bit in the photograph. And I should say, this brush I'm using is it's actually, I think, Danny Gardner's brush he gave me. It's just a triangle, and it has a little texture turned on to it, and I think it follows direction, but it's not. It's nice because you get a little texture to it. You get a little, but you can hold a little hard edge. But you could do it with also just a basic round brush. It's not. The brush isn't giving me anything special, but I like the way it feels. It's kind of nice, albeit hard to control when drawing circles or ellipses. So then back to my cleanup layer. So I fixed up the perspective a little bit, refined the design, and now I've got to go back to my original cleanup layer and start to get the perspective and alignment of my colors and textures to work with my new design. So I'm sort of looking through the photograph, looking at my new silhouette, refining those elements. I'm bringing in a little bit more reflected light there from the sky to the left. Remember, that entire front is in shadow, so the only way we get to show any of the forms there is with reflected light. Let a little bit of light leak in there. Again, coming from the right, maybe a little cast shadow across that cylinder. Again, just guessing at those things. And the reflected light from below is being blocked a little bit by that cylinder cutting across the shape. So trying to get that to read a little bit better. It's really just noodle time, right? At this point, I'm about, I don't know, halfway through the thing, a little past halfway, and you got your silhouette working, the stance is working, you've got all your proportions done, and now it's one more refinement pass on the perspective and adding details, cut lines, little panels that start to, like that little one I just put in there, that's catching a little bit more sky from the other side. This is getting more light, right, because it's the light side of our vehicle. There's the more light coming back in. So you can see if I turn those off, that was just back to my base layer. I don't know why I did that. More light, more details. So it's kind of my secondary refinement pass. So I actually go back in and I don't worry about trying to make it match exactly to the thing I did in the grayscale. I'm sort of revisiting the shapes now and see how they're working. And if they're not, I just change them at this level. But all the basic forms are there. If I squint my eyes, it looks three-dimensional, has a strong silhouette, which, can be, that's a stylistic choice. Is the silhouette something that you like? And if it is, maybe show that off by putting it, in this case, dark against light. And if it's something that you don't want to show off, which might be the case, maybe you want to show more of the interior shapes, then we want to minimize the value change from the object to the background. And that would make more of the interior shapes show up and have a weaker silhouette. And in this case, the strength of this, I think, works. It's kind of interesting, so I'm letting the silhouette be very strong. Now it's noodle time again on the design refinements. So again, this is going to stay pretty loose and a little, unresolved in some areas, but it's meant to be sort of an afternoon sketch. Again, like I said, it's a little over 2 hours, so you can, probably whip out a couple of these in an afternoon and to get the rough idea across. And of course, you can always go back, refine, and then even maybe jump into 3D modeling elements of this if you're really going to refine it and take it further. And right now, this is like the little origami painting here, which is just you're folding and bending surfaces. I'm starting to put some cut lines across those surfaces that I've bent, and casting shadows, trying to get more realism in there. Again, it's just application of the foundation lighting. It's just light and shadow, really all matte surface. I'm not really putting in a lot of reflectivity here at all. It's a little hint of some reflectance, in that, some little bit of shine on that very, very top surface of this, where it picks up a little bit more of the blue sky. But all in all, it's treating it primarily as just a straight up matte surface and tweaking little elements, refining it. And all the time I'm looking at my interior lines and sort of pulling those interior lines from the silhouette to the interior of the shape and seeing if the things that are hinted at the silhouette work when I bend them sort of into the interior. I'm going to define that little vent a little bit more. It's really fun. This is sort of the, for me, a really fun part of the painting process, although maybe not super, exciting in a tutorial, because it can go on for a little while. But this is like sculpting with clay for me. You have all your colors and values, and you're just tweaking them, and it's amazing how subtle a change you can make in a value shift, and your brain will see that form change. So I'm just going in and bending and folding. I didn't like that little shape I put in there, so got rid of it. And adding little cut lines, moving shapes around, testing them out. I'm trying to resolve how that little bent element on the right hand side of that vent is going to flow back into the rest of the shape. I got to say, curved shapes are actually a lot easier to render than these sort of folded shapes. The folded shapes are tough because they need to resolve, whereas curved shapes can just sort of flow into each other, and you can fake it much easier. Folded angular shapes are a little bit tougher because they have, at least I find it tougher, because they have to blend into each other. And once you fold it in one direction, it sets up a section or a plane change, right, that you sort of have to stick with until you hit the next fold. So it can be a little bit trickier. So here I'm doing a little vent. So there's a little vent sticking out there from the side. I'm assuming this thing's got some sort of power source, generates some heat. It's going to have some sort of a vent, right? I mean, this is all just make-believe sci-fi stuff, so why not? If it looks good and it looks interesting, drop it on there. And now I'm sort of figuring out this again. See, looking at my silhouette, pulling those shapes to the interior, and figuring out how those shapes are going to wrap. But really, it's got to be defined by that silhouette. So there's a little edge, and maybe it's a slightly darker material at the back. So it doesn't have to be exactly the same values as the side of the vehicle. It could be painted, right? Literally painted a darker local color or value, and it's, gets a different value scale then. So that's a little cast shadow from that little edge that rolls under and from the vent itself. I will have to detail the vent here in a minute. Bring in a little bit of reflected light. So you see I go down and pick the ground color. Should also say I have my Wacom pin set up. The front button is set to option. Alt if you're on a PC, and what I do is just click the button once and I get the color picker and go down, and that allows me to pick from within my painting. So you can see I don't really do I don't pull up the swatches. I do have this color wheel. This thing's pretty cool. This is called Magic Picker. If you find it online, it's a little Photoshop plugin, and it gives you that nice traditional color wheel and triangle inside, much like you get in Painter, right? The program Painter, which is much more familiar if you've been classically trained in acrylic painting or color theory classes, etc. So I find that a little bit more helpful. So I have that open usually, and now I'm just glazing around and picking back out details, refining shapes. And it's going to come together here. It's starting to come together, and you see, you can just go back and revisit any of the forms that you're unhappy with. So I keep looking around the shape, bringing in a little bit more of the sky, trying to figure out what's up on top there. And you can see you can spend actually a lot of time on these because they can just get more and more and more refined. And as they get more refined, then you're going to say, well, what's on that panel? Are there some fasteners that hold it on? Are there some graphics? Are there some instructions on there, like lift here and open here and don't step here, all that sort of classic military stuff. And putting in some cut lines, pulling out some little edges here and there. Again, I usually leave the cut lines last because you'll see all the paintings happening on one layer at the top. Right? I do have my perspective grid floating over the whole thing. and that's helping me when I just sketch in new shapes to see if I can get them closer to being on perspective. But all the painting is just one layer. So more noodling and more noodling, and refining it. And now you can see the making some subtle changes to the values to try and get those panels to bend just a little bit, adding a couple more cut lines and evaluating it. Sort of always, good thing to do is, as always, squint your eyes a little bit, see if the big shapes are reading. If they are, that's great. Then move to the next level of shapes and see if those are working. I'm not doing a lot of zooming in and out here. Probably for future tutorials on the iPad like this, I'll try to zoom in a bit more. But honestly, this is more the size that I paint. In fact, a lot of times paint even with the image smaller than this. So it would be a bit deceiving actually to zoom in. It would look better on the iPad, but it also would not be the way that I actually work. And the reason I keep stuff fairly small is I don't want to over detail it. I want to be able to see the big shapes more easily. So having it a little bit smaller on my monitor helps me work faster actually. Also the lines are easier to draw freehand. Shorter straight lines are easier to do than these big long ones. So actually it's kind of like thumbnail sketching, and anybody seen a lot of my thumbnail sketches from my books, you know that I tend to sketch fairly small. And again, for me it's more about speed. If I can sketch small accurately, then I can always scan it, blow it up, refine it like I am here in Photoshop, and then print it out large, and it all holds together. So here I'm dropping in the shadow, redefining the ground plane, and what I did is I added a layer to the bottom between my background layer and the object layer for my mech, and I set it to multiply. And now I'm just darkening it, and again the shadows has a sharper edge closer to the object and gets a little fuzzier as it moves further away. It's also darkest right up against the object. And now I'm going to go back in and refine the form even further. Starting to pick up a little bit of reflected light, pick up a little bit of skylight there from the background. Since that whole leg, both of those legs are all in shadow. I can only use the skylight coming down from the upper left to show the forms on that leg, and of course the reflected light. And here I'm just refining the graphic a little bit, and now I've got to work out and see if I can, again, see I'm pulling my silhouette shapes. I'm taking those little pointy ear guys and I'm trying to pull those into the interior of my shape and see if I can come up with something there that I like. So I'm just pulling, so sort of faceting the interior. And so I went up to the side of my vehicle, the Mech, and picked the color and value there to make it all work together, and faceting that back. Again, I'm trying to use the silhouette and the original sketch to help inform what I'm doing here, but you'd have to get in there and sort of start sculpting and making it up on as you're painting. So that's what's happening here. And I didn't like that part, so just paint it over. And it just sort of glaze over. This is probably akin more to, acrylic painting, I would say, more than anything else, in the context of a traditional media type of rendering. And pick up a little bit of reflected light. Again, trying to define sort of a front edge or a front surface to that's in the shadow, because my light's coming from the right. And now, of course, whenever I look back at these things, when I'm laying in the audio for the tutorial, I always see stuff I wish I would have done differently. But I think that's the case when you do a first sketch. It's the first pass at this thing. I don't really know much about this design other than what I'm discovering while rendering this. And here I'm defining those little horizontal vent guys, some little louvers. Maybe those would be made out of a different material. Dropping in a few little cut lines. Maybe there's some fasteners or some graphics that attach through, right? And those would be some, who knows, maybe for maintenance, those are important things, or things that need to be identified to take it apart or put it back together. and more refinements. Again, squinting at it, looking at it, double checking the perspectives. Now I'm refining the perspective here. Again, my grid there is on top. So it's kind of a flowing process. You don't have to get all the perspective right. You don't have to resolve everything in the design before you start painting. You can definitely go back, and don't be afraid to glaze over that stuff and just change it. So here's a big change. I didn't like those little guys cutting across there, so I'm just going back and sort of refolding the sheet metal and making a new shape. So picking the right colors and values, and now we'll have a new design in that area. So it's not precious. None of it's precious. It's all, came together fairly fast. It was based on a super loose little sketch, so wouldn't expect it to be very resolved. And don't be afraid to go back in there and just paint over entire areas that you're not happy with. And in fact, it's where most of the time will probably be spent, is in doing the design work. See, now I'm opened up a couple custom brushes here. I just went and found a circle brush, just a ring, and I manipulated its size and its orientation to drop a little ellipse on the side of that thing. And now I'm going to erase it, and it's on its separate layer at the top, and that's just going to be a tighter cut line around that gun shape. And now I'm going to add a little cut line to it, but I wanted to have that back part right nice and circular, so it was faster to just use a brush, change its shape a little to make it an ellipse, drop it on the back side of that, and I'll maybe put some little fasteners or vents or mechanism behind there. Yeah, it kind of looks like that gun assembly might be able to pivot. Actually, it doesn't look like it's going to pivot much, but maybe it's how it's made, it's how it's assembled. That's a separate piece or a separate panel. And there we go, folding that surface now. Again, trying to stick with the aesthetic and the theme of this, which sort of has this faceted, folded surfaces, and trying to pull that back into that little panel. I could use the same brush and really refine those gun barrels, but this is not that tight a sketch, so I'm leaving those all sort of loose and trying to refine the far side silhouette a bit. And you can see now, to refine silhouette, I have a layer on the very top that is not a clipping path layer, right? It's not looking at the original silhouette. I don't want to have to keep going back to that at this point. So at this point, I have new layers on top for my final detailing passes. And that allows me to go right out and sketch. I could even be picking the color from the background if I want. There, I did a little change to my base layer, erasing it. And I'm looking at my perspective guidelines. You can see the bottom of that cylinder that was cutting, left to right across the shape needed some refinement. And again, everything I'm painting here and all the, the knowledge of how to paint these surfaces is all back to really foundation skills of how to make forms read with value. So it's really about, if you can understand how to render matte surfaces, which again I mentioned before is covered in other tutorials. This one's about Photoshop techniques, my pipeline of painting inside Photoshop, using the photographs that you've taken as inspiration and source material for your colors and textures. And then your layering strategy, how to fix the perspective in Photoshop using paths. And there we go, just tightening it up a bit. Now I've turned off my grid above. Let's hide the color picker. Sort of evaluate it and see where it's at. Yeah, I think for a rough color sketch, it's working okay. And now I go back and keep on tweaking it. I think that that hole, when I looked at it, was just too hot, meaning it was drawing too much of your attention. So now I'm going to grab a textured brush, and it's just a brush I made, like sort of, I use it a lot for dust and steam and things like that, smoke. And I've added a layer over my background So it's between my object and my background. And I'm going to start to add a bit of texture because I want this thing in some, it's not necessarily a war zone, but I want it to be in a dirty environment. And the thing looks pretty filthy. It's got lots of texture on it. So I would imagine that, the way it got that way was by being in an environment that has a lot of, dust and texture and atmosphere. So I've just extended that over. My canvas was a little crowded. I also want to leave a little bit of room to add one last element on the left. And painting out the background now, extending it over. You could just drag it and make a copy as well, but that was painted over, so just gonna fast to just paint it. And I'm adding another layer on top. This is just a levels adjustment layer, and what I've done is I've inverted it back to black so nothing's happening, and now I'm painting white into that levels adjustment, and I'm actually bringing more light into the light side of this. I thought I could increase that contrast a bit. And instead of painting over the whole thing, it's much faster to just use a level adjustment layer and do your levels adjustment globally and then invert it by turning it off, making it black, and then paint back into it using white. And what's nice, it's on a separate layer. You can change its opacity to change the strength. You can also revisit your histogram there for the levels and adjust it that way as well. Okay, I've added one more layer on top. I've added a color layer. You can see it's set to color, and I'm just grabbing my paintbrush and I'm actually colorizing all the values below it. So I'm just adding a couple colored graphics. Again, I don't want to repaint the anything. Since I already have the forms working, now I just need to get the colors right in a couple of areas. So I'm just adding a couple colored panels. Again, my layer is set to color, and I'm just painting with a normal brush, picking some of the colors from within my mech and colorizing different areas of it. A really fast, effective way to add graphics. Now, the graphics are the same value as the background. If you wanted the graphics to be a different value, you would have to be like, bright or dark. You'd have to pull them off on a separate background or do a little adjustment layer with the levels to lighten or darken the graphics. But in this case, I just wanted to colorize a couple little elements. Okay, now I'm adding some atmosphere and some dust rolling along on the ground in front of it. For me, the legs were becoming too important, so I want to have some wind sort of blowing through the foreground, picking up some dust. So I'm just dropping in some little speckles here. And what I'm going to do with those, they're on a separate layer on the top, right? And they're bright, they're catching a little bit more light. And now I'm going to put a little motion blur on them. Okay, so it looks like they're little bits of, leaves or dust and debris blowing through in the foreground. Now I've added a new layer with some more speckles of dirt and debris. It gives it a little bit of life. Again, I thought the legs were looking a bit static and a bit, they had too much contrast, so that dust and debris flowing through the foreground helps soften it. I have those blowing at a slightly different angle, and now I'm going to go back in, I'm going to warp those. Like there's a, the wind is sort of whipping around and those little guys are blowing in different directions. And it gives it, again, a little bit more life as opposed to just a straight motion blur where everything goes in the same direction. Makes it a little bit more organic. And we're almost done with this thing, actually. I'm going to add one more layer here to my background, and I'm going to play around with a little gradation running through it. So picking that sky color, doing a little bit of shifting. So I'm actually just shifting the color. Thought I had a little bit too much of the ground color in the background. So technically I should probably, recolorize the top surface of my mech at this point to match the sky a little bit if I wanted to really make it match. And again, laying in another dust layer. Right, that's how I'm going to deaden it just a little bit. That's on top of the color gradation I just did, but it's on a separate layer, just set to normal. So just knocking it back. Now it's got sort of that right feel that I want. That allows me to control the strength of the silhouette in certain areas by varying the background values. And now I'm going to grab something for scale. So I have a bunch of figures in here, and I'm going to grab my figure brush, and I'm going to size it, and I'm going to drop a human figure in here for scale. So it's just set to black, basically. I'm going to click it once, and that's done. So it's there on that layer, and it's basically right next to my mech layer, just below it. But that's just enough to give me the sense of scale. And until that point, we really didn't know what the scale was. But that's just enough. And then I put him back there in the shadow on purpose, so it was simple and he could just be a silhouette. And that's really all it takes. Now I'm going to add signature, and I add a border. And that's going to get us very close to the end. So I hope you found this helpful. It's a fast, fun way to work. And I hope you give it a try. There's a little zoom in shot. And see, it has a lot of the texture from the sketch, a lot of the texture from the photographs. And it is very loose, but conveys the idea, gets across the concept, and that's the main goal. So thanks again, and see you next time.